Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. Get ready for today's unnerving journey. I'd been planning my solo camping trip to Angeles National Forest for months. Life in Los Angeles was hectic, and I needed an escape. Just me, the wilderness, and the kind of quiet you can only find far away from the city. I arrived at the trailhead early on a Saturday morning, the sun still low in the sky. The air was cool and smelled like pine, a welcome change from the smog and asphalt of LA. My plan was to hike for a few hours, set up camp near one of the remote trails, and spend the evening unwinding by a small fire with a book. The hike started off uneventfully. The trail was narrow but well marked, winding through dense clusters of trees. I passed a few other hikers early on, exchanging polite nods, but as I went deeper into the forest, I was completely alone. At least, that's what I thought. About 3 hours in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a tingling at the back of my neck, the kind of sensation you get when someone's staring at you. I stopped and scanned the trees, but there was nothing unusual, just the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. I shook it off and kept walking, but the feeling only grew stronger. I started glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced I'd see someone, or something, following me. Still, the trail behind me was empty. By the time I reached the clearing where I'd planned to set up camp, the feeling had eased a bit. I'd told myself it was just paranoia. After all, I was alone in the woods. My mind was bound to play tricks on me. That night, after a simple dinner cooked over my portable stove, I settled into my tent. The stars were brilliant, and the forest was peaceful, exactly what I'd come for. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, I heard it. A faint, rustling sound outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I held still, straining my ears, but the sound didn't move away. It was close, circling the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, heart pounding. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. The sound stopped as soon as I opened the tent, and after a few minutes of searching, I convinced myself it was nothing. I crawled back inside and tried to sleep. But the rustling came back. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random movement. It sounded like footsteps. My chest tightened, and I debated whether to stay put or investigate again. I opted to stay in the tent, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. Eventually, the noises stopped, and the forest was silent again. Somehow, I managed to drift off, though my sleep was restless and filled with strange dreams. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. The unease from the day before hadn't left me, and I figured it was better to pack up and head home. As I approached my car at the trailhead, my stomach dropped. There were handprints on the windows. They weren't mine. I hadn't touched the glass. The prints were smeared, as if someone had been dragging their fingers across the surface. My car had been parked far from the main trail, in a spot where no one should have been. I snapped a photo of the handprints, threw my gear in the trunk, and got out of there as fast as I could. A few days later, I was scrolling through local news when a headline caught my eye: "Missing hiker in Angeles National Forest." The article detailed the disappearance of a woman who'd been camping alone in the same area I had. Authorities had found her abandoned car near a trailhead with strange handprints smeared on the windows. The accompanying photo sent chills down my spine. They were identical to the ones I'd seen on my car. I don't know who or what was out there in the forest with me that night, but I haven't been camping since. Of all the places we live, nothing confesses up to a trip there. Looking around, I was impressed. The red rock formations of Acadia National Park had always called to me. My best friend Eric and I decided to spend a weekend camping there, escaping the noise of Salt Lake City for a few days of hiking, stargazing, and campfire stories. We arrived in Praia facility mid-afternoon and set up camp at a designated site near Devil's Garden. The views were surreal, towering arches, crimson cliffs, and a vast sky stretching endlessly above us. It felt like we were on another planet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a campfire and started making dinner. Simple stuff, just beans and hot dogs. The smell of smoke and charred meat filled the air, blending perfectly with the crisp desert night. That's when we heard footsteps, crunching on the gravel path behind us. "Hey there," a man's voice called. Eric and I turned to see a lone hiker approaching. He was tall and lean, wearing a dusty backpack and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He smiled as he stepped into the firelight, but something about him felt off. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" he asked, gesturing to the fire. Eric hesitated, but I figured it would be rude to say no. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, and people out here tended to look out for each other. "Sure," I said. "Have a seat." The man introduced himself as Tom. He said he'd been hiking through the park for a few days and was heading toward Moab. He was friendly enough, cracking a few jokes and complimenting our fire-building skills, but he avoided answering any personal questions. "So, where are you from?" Eric asked casually. "Here and there," Tom said, staring into the flames. "Camping solo," I added. "Yeah, prefer it that way." His responses were short, and he had a strange habit of deflecting the conversation back to us. After a while, the silence grew uncomfortable. Tom didn't seem interested in leaving, though. He sat there, poking at the fire with his stick, his face unreadable. Eventually, Eric yawned loudly and said, "Well, we should probably turn in. Long hike tomorrow." Tom nodded, stood up, and gave us a curt "good night" before wandering off into the darkness. Eric and I exchanged a glance, but didn't say anything. We put out the fire, secured our gear, and crawled into our tent. I woke up to a strange noise sometime after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the tent, but then I realized it was something, or someone, breathing. My eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight filtering through the tent. That's when I saw him, Tom, standing over us, holding one of our camping knives. My heart stopped. "Eric," I whispered, nudging him awake. Eric stirred, groggily opening his eyes, and froze when he saw Tom. "What the hell are you doing?" Eric demanded, his voice shaking. Tom didn't answer. He just stood there, gripping the knife tightly, his face eerily calm. Adrenaline surged through me. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly into his eyes. Tom recoiled, giving Eric enough time to lunge at him. The tent collapsed in the chaos, trapping all three of us in a tangle of fabric. I scrambled to find an opening, my hands trembling as I clawed at the zipper. Eric wrestled with Tom, grunting and shouting as they fought for control of the knife. Finally, I managed to crawl out and grab a rock from the campsite. I swung it at Tom's arm, and he dropped the knife with a yelp. Eric kicked him off, and we both ran for the car, leaving everything else behind. We drove straight to the park ranger station, breathless and shaking. The rangers took our report and assured us they'd look into it. The next day, a ranger called us back. "You're lucky," he said grimly. Tom wasn't just some random drifter. He was a wanted fugitive, suspected of attacking campers in several national parks across the Southwest. They found our tent shredded, our gear scattered, but no sign of him. To this day, I can't look at a knife or a campfire without remembering the look on his face as he stood over us. There's something eerie about the woods at night. The kind of quiet that isn't really quiet. The rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the faint howl of wind brushing through the trees. My friends and I had set up camp in Acadia National Park, a place we'd heard was as breathtaking as it was remote. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from our daily grind in Portland, Maine. But as we sat around the fire that night, roasting marshmallows and trading stories, something strange happened. It started as a faint sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a bird, but then Sarah stiffened. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all went silent, straining our ears. There it was again, a faint, high-pitched cry. It sounded like a baby. "Who brings a baby camping?" Mark asked, frowning. "It's probably just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The sound was unmistakably human. The crying continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, away from the marked trails. "We should check it out," Sarah said, standing up. "Are you crazy?" I replied, grabbing her arm. "It's pitch dark out there. We don't even know where it's coming from." "What if someone's in trouble?" she argued. "It doesn't make sense," Mark said, shaking his head. "Who'd be out there with a baby at this hour? And why aren't they coming toward the campsites?" The crying stopped abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. That silence, it was worse than the crying. "Okay, that's creepy," Sarah admitted, sitting back down. We debated for a while, but in the end, caution won out. None of us felt comfortable wandering into the dark woods without a clear idea of what we'd find. We locked the food away, doused the fire, and retreated to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound, but the night remained eerily still. The next morning, as we packed up our campsite, I noticed something strange. Footprints. Small, bare footprints, leading away from our tents and into the woods. "Did anyone see these last night?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "No way. I would have noticed." We followed the trail a short distance before it disappeared into the underbrush. Later, as we drove back into town, we stopped at a diner for breakfast. While waiting for our food, I overheard a snippet of conversation from the next booth. "Missing kid, disappeared last week. They think he might have wandered off near the trails." My stomach dropped. "Excuse me," I said, leaning over. "Did you say a kid went missing?" The man nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah. 2 years old. His parents were hiking near here. They've been searching the area, but no luck so far." "When did this happen?" Maka asked. "About 6 days ago," the man replied. We exchanged uneasy glances. 6 days. The crying we'd heard was just last night. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods. The missing child was never found, and the footprints we saw didn't make any sense. All I know is that I'll never camp near Acadia again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. To me, van life was all about freedom, the open road, endless skies, and the quiet beauty of America's hidden gems. That's why I found myself parked in the heart of Arizona's Pretified Forest National Park one crisp autumn evening. The park was nearly deserted, with most visitors leaving by sunset. I had chosen a secluded spot off a gravel trail, surrounded by ancient, colorful rock formations that seemed to glow under the moonlight. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a quick dinner of canned soup, I locked the van, crawled into my makeshift bed in the back, and drifted off to the distant sound of wind sweeping through the trees. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe it was instinct, a subtle sound out of place. My eyes snapped open, and I strained to listen. At first, nothing. Then, a faint scratching at the side door of my van. I froze, my heart pounding. Someone was outside. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't just curious. They were trying to get in. I reached for my phone and fumbled to turn on the security app linked to my van's alarm system. Before I could activate it, the door handle rattled violently. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to scare them off. No response. With trembling hands, I hit the alarm button. The van's horn blared, shattering the silence of the night. I heard hurried footsteps retreating into the darkness, followed by a clattering sound. A tool dropped in the rush. I stayed locked inside, too afraid to step out. When the police arrived half an hour later, they found the crowbar lying near the door. "This isn't the first report we've had like this," one officer said, shining his flashlight around the area. "A few travelers have been targeted recently, mostly solo campers. Same MO, someone trying to break in, then taking off when they're interrupted." "Did you catch anyone?" I asked, still shaken. The officer shook his head. "Not yet. These parks are big, and the guy knows how to disappear. Just be glad you're okay." I thanked them, but the relief was short-lived. As I drove away the next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the intruder. What would have happened if the alarm hadn't scared them off? To this day, I still love van life, but I've become more cautious. When you're alone in the vastness of nature, it's easy to forget how vulnerable you really are, until someone reminds you. There's nothing like a weekend away with your closest friends. Our group, me, Sarah, Jason, and Alyssa, had planned this camping trip to Mount Rainier for weeks. Living in Seattle, we craved the escape from city life, trading concrete and car horns for towering pines and crisp mountain air. We reached the campsite just before sunset. The view was postcard perfect. Mount Rainier looming in the distance, its snowy peak glowing in the fading light. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night, laughing and joking as the stars began to dot the sky. The thing about camping is that you have to embrace being disconnected. Cell service was non-existent this far out, which we didn't mind, at least not at first. "No text, no emails, no doom scrolling," Jason said, holding up his phone. "It's paradise." "Speak for yourself," Alyssa replied. "I don't feel safe without Google Maps." "You don't need Google Maps to sit by a fire," Sarah teased, tossing a marshmallow at her. We all laughed, but then Jason's phone buzzed. Wait, what?" he said, frowning at the screen. I thought we didn't have signal." He held up the phone, showing us a notification. It was a text message, but the sender's number was just a string of random digits. The message itself was gibberish, symbols, numbers, and broken words. "Probably some spam that got through," I said. Jason shrugged and tossed the phone aside. "Whatever, it's camping time." But about an hour later, his phone buzzed again. This time the message wasn't gibberish. 4 people, campfire, 47-degree long, 120-degree lat. Jason read it out loud, his face pale. That's us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's probably a coincidence," Alyssa said quickly, though her tone betrayed her nerves. Or some automated thing. Automated how? I ask. This isn't funny. The phone buzzed again. Jason's hands shook as he unlocked it. One stands, others seated. Fire still burning. At that moment, Alyssa had been standing while the rest of us were sitting. The fire crackled between us, its warmth suddenly feeling more menacing than comforting. Okay, this is seriously messed up, Jason said, shoving his phone into his pocket. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves it had to be some weird prank. But as the night wore on, the messages kept coming. They described everything we did in real time. One walks to the tent, two laugh, one pours water on fire. We decided to turn the phones off entirely, but the unease had settled in. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch felt amplified in the silence. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. We need to leave, I whispered. No one argued. We packed up in record time, throwing everything into the car and speeding off into the night. When we finally reached a town, we turned Jason's phone back on. There was one last message waiting. Leaving now. Safe travels. We stared at each other, too shaken to speak. A few days later, I stumbled upon a local news article. It mentioned reports of a rogue cell tower in the Mount Rainier area, intercepting signals and potentially being used for invasive surveillance or other illicit activities. Authorities hadn't been able to determine who was responsible. To this day, we don't know who was watching us or why, but I've never been able to enjoy the mountains the same way again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.